A career National Guard captain, Marcus Hale, chooses duty over his daughter Emma's wedding when an unexpected call to lead a domestic emergency keeps him away. Haunted by the empty chair at the reception he never saw, Marcus returns to his small hometown a week later to find the chapel where Emma married alive with memories. And one last surprise, his unit, who turned out to be the family he'd never admitted he needed. Through slow, awkward conversations and a tense confrontation with Emma and her new husband, Marcus confronts what duty cost him and what it can give back. The story explores duty vs. love, the quiet, stubborn forms of courage, and how a man can be remade by the people who follow him. Not because he ordered them to, but because they chose him as family. It's cinematic, sensory, and emotionally raw, moving from guilt and distance to the warm, messy reconciliation born of shared sacrifice. He had imagined the empty chair 1,000 times. On the map table, under the fluorescent glare aboard the armory truck that smelled of diesel and new vinyl, Marcus Hale watched a little paper square of a wedding program as if it were a country he could conquer. The truck shuddered over a pothole and the program slid toward the edge. In his hand, his phone buzzed again, a photo from Emma of lace and a bouquet and a short message. "Don't make me do this without you, Dad, please." He thumbed back a reply that could have been either comforting or cruel. Words always betrayed him during these hours. Duty finished writing the rest. The call came at dawn. The flood breached the levee to the west of town and a neighborhood downstream. Mobile homes and trailers clustered low along the creek. Vanished in a single, terrible night. The county needed the guard. Marcus, as the oldest company commander on duty, pulled on the weighty uniform he had worn for 20 years and boarded the transport with 8 other men and women, shaking his head at the paper in his pocket. "Tell her I'm sorry," he said into a bag of MREs, the words for both the program and his daughter. The radio chirped, and the captain's voice into his earpiece sounded like a judge's hammer. "You're needed here. The state is asking." He had been late to things before. Birthdays, little league games where he turned up in the 3rd inning with a bag of greasy celebratory pizza because the volunteer firefighters had needed a hand. He had missed recitals for deconfliction meetings and Thanksgiving dinners for night patrols. Each absence had been rationalized by some urgent necessity: a drill, a crisis, a man's life. But Emma's wedding sat on the calendar like a ledger entry that leaned toward ruin when he did not attend. Marcus kept the ledger neat. He had always kept it neat. Duty went on the left column, family on the right, and the left grew wide with ink. They left under a sky that had been poured from steel. The river had been monstrous in the photos, brown with angry debris, trees turned into teeth. Marcus's hands on the steering wheel had felt smaller than the wheel. They worked for 72 hours without sleep, sandbagging houses, erecting emergency shelters in the high school gym, ferrying people from sagging roofs. And the clock ticked past the afternoon Emma was to stand in the warmed, candlelit chapel up on Elm Street, his parish, its stone face sweating in the humidity of late summer. His voice on the radio was steady. He ordered a team to the Walnut Trailer Park to shore up a collapsed foundation. He argued with logistics about accommodations for evacuees. When the ceremony's hour passed, Marcus stood under a municipal overpass and watched water like ink swallow a pickup truck. He imagined a photograph. Emma's laugh, mid-vow, Daniel's hand in hers, and pushed the image away because there was work. Duty had a way of narrowing the world to the width of what was in front of you. Save the lives you can. Ask forgiveness later. The first 2 days afterward were a blur of caffeine and sweat. They worked into nights lit by portable lamps. The radio was a small, constant comfort, a human signal looped by voices that kept shape in his head. He called in the midnight lull between operations, phone on his lap in the command tent. Emma's message filled his inbox, a string of 3 texts, a picture of her dress pinned to a chair, a photograph of a bouquet, then a voice memo. He listened to it while the generator hummed like a living thing. Her voice had a brittle quality. She laughed to keep from crying. "I know why you had to stay," she said in the message. "But if you could just be here to give me away, it's stupid. I know it's crazy." But he rewound the memo until the hum of the generator cicaded with her syllables. "Eem," he whispered into the bareness of the tent. "I'm coming back as soon as I can." The words were a promise and a lie. By the time they were released, mud crusted his boots, and the ache nested under his ribs like a second heart. The county had been secured. The evacuees were dry and fed, sleeping in cots with donated quilts folded like flags. Marcus accepted the last of the gratitude with a tired, automatic smile. There had been no medal, no official praise, just the quiet appraisal from neighbors. A handshake, a pause, "Thank you." That felt like a coin tossed into a concrete well. His phone lit with a dozen missed calls and a line of text messages that duplicated an ache. "You missed it." She married him. It was beautiful. He drove back to town under the late sun, the one that makes sidewalks glow like old coins. The road seemed the same at first, lined with maples and the occasional dog tethered to the porch. But Marcus noticed the details as a man notices a photograph only after the lens has been removed. The chapel steeple dipped into a slice of blue, the bakery on Main with pies cooling in the window, a group of teenage boys launching themselves off the riverbank into a cloud of spray. He parked where he always did, behind the municipal building, under a sycamore with bark like fried skin. The chapel's heavy wooden doors were closed. The wedding ribbons still clung to the brass knobs, white as if the satin had not yet acknowledged the season of use. There was a program nailed to the vestibule: Hail, Langston, Emma's name in a looping script. Marcus's throat tightened. He carried guilt the way soldiers carry gear, heavy and quiet until it springs a hinge. Inside, the chapel smelled of beeswax and the faint, reassuring presence of incense nobody knew whether to call pious or perfunctory. The pews were still scattered with the little things that signal the end of something: a lone heel left on the aisle, a crumpled handkerchief, a scattering of petals like a pale snowfall on the floor. The altar was pristine, the candles still upright, as if the light that once burned them had been swept out in a hurry. Marcus walked through the nave like a man entering a church after a funeral. He imagined Emma under the archway, laughing with Daniel, the priest smiling with the benevolent ignorance of someone who presides over vows. He had hoped for a moment to steal back what he had given away to duty. He had rehearsed his words 1,000 times in the weeks of hard work and sleepless nights. "I am sorry. Let me explain. We can rebuild." He rehearsed explanations that could be understood without being righteous. He rehearsed small things. A joke about the rain, a story of her scraped knee when she was 7, to coax a smile into existence. He wanted to be ordinary in the way fathers and daughters can be only when the world is quiet. Instead, he found silence. The choir loft light winked out, and he could hear his own breath against the stone. "Marcus." The voice behind him was Sandy Langston's, Emma's mother, in-law, small hands clasped together like a rosary of worry. Her face was flushed as if she had run the length of Elm Street. "Oh, Captain Hale, I thought we'd missed you." He turned. Her eyes were wet, and for a second he saw his daughter in their shape, the same stubborn jaw. "I missed her," he said, and it sounded stranger than the sentence should have. He had rehearsed this, too. What he would say to people who awaited the explanations of duty. But the words got lost in the architecture. "Everyone's in the parish hall," Sandy said. "They had a reception." "They?" She hesitated, as if choosing to explain what generosity looked like in a small town. They had some of your men help. They gave Emma away. The world turned, not so much collapsing as changing into another scene in the same play. Marcus felt his knees go faint as if he'd climbed a hill and the summit had given way. "My men," he said, and the words held a note of both pride and shame. He had sent them into the flood, and they had given something back to the family he'd nearly thrown away. "They said you had to be here," Sandy explained, "but they wanted you in the photograph, so they stood in as your honor guard, if that's what you call it." They walked her down the aisle. "Captain, they—" Her fingers opened in a little blossom of explanation. "They wanted her to know you were there in spirit." Marcus's vision blurred at the edges. He thanked Sandy with a small, clipped word and made for the hall, each step a negotiation with the memory of boots on wet earth, of men sliding sacks of sand under moonlight. The parish hall was warm with the smell of fried chicken and coffee, laughter already smoothing over the grief of his absence. There were ribbons and a cake with a plastic bride and groom, perched on top like a trophy in a miniature world. He felt like a relic misplaced. He stood at the doorway as dozens of faces recognized him. Some looked quickly away. Some nodded in the measured way of people who have known military service as a background hum to their lives. Emma was nowhere in sight. He wanted to find her, to put his hand on the small of her back and feel the dampness of a life he had missed. Instead, his eye snagged on something else, a line of fatigues folded on a pew like a regiment of small flags. The company had left its jackets in a neat row, like ceremonial armor. "Captain," someone said, before he could process the small act. Sergeant Rosa Alvarez approached him with the casual authority of someone used to carrying heavy things. Her hair was tied back, shadowed eyes like tempered steel. Marcus had known her for 10 years. First as his subordinate, then as the steady voice who could coax the indecipherable language of field reports into human terms. She had hands calloused from loading trucks and a laugh that came when she wanted to remind people they were still alive. "We thought it best to wait," she said, as if that explained their appearance at a place where insignia usually did not belong. "You're not the only one who holds a duty, Captain. We held one for you." He saw, then, the circle they had formed. Not all of them, but half the company sat at the long tables between platters of food and vases of wildflowers. They looked not like soldiers in mock valor, but as a family who had come to a funeral and decided to stay for the cake. The room hummed with low, private jokes, the soft mutters of people who had known one another in ways that made them speak in shorthand. "Emma told us," Alvarez began, but Marcus stopped her with a motion he did not intend. She took a breath that might have asked for his permission and didn't get it, because in his chest something had broken open. In a quiet place, he had been returned to a world where his men could not only follow orders, but make promises that had nothing to do with rank. "Where is she?" he asked finally. "In the chapel," Rosa said. "She stayed after. She wanted a moment. We thought you should see her where she says yes." He found Emma at the foot of the altar, still clutching a little square of the lace from her dress. She was alone, upright as a sapling, eyes rimmed with the pink you get when you face a decision and live. She had not seen him yet. When their gazes found each other across the aisle, he felt the same acute recognition he used to feel when he'd first lifted her into his arms in the hospital. The knowledge of the exact person you had helped create and the ache of having failed to watch the small things that make them whole. Emma's face was a carved thing, made from the years of two people's decisions. Her hair had been looped into something that made her seem both younger and older at once. She wore her mother's pearl bracelet. They had spent their lives opposing and matching one another like rows of teeth. Her mouth curved at him in that private way she reserved for bad jokes made by men who had once been her father's friends. "You finally got your leave," she said. The words were sharp only because she had not wanted to be understood that quickly. "I had to stay," he said.
There was the flood.
He paused because saying, "we," made it sound as if his team had been all the world to him. They had been, in a way that frightened him. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he added, the words like a key turning in a lock he could not see. "You weren't there?" she said simply. "You told me not to make a fuss, Dad. You said duty comes first." There was a flatness that said she had cataloged his absences like a ledger. "Do you know what it's like to make a choice and have someone you love right? I understand. Because they love you. Do you know what it's like to stand alone in a church and hear the echo of the other chair?" He swallowed. His throat worked around something that had lodged itself like a stone. "I know I made a choice." "It wasn't just about the chairs," she said. "It was the things you didn't see. The little things. The look that says you were waiting for someone who would never come. I know work has a shape, Dad. I know it occupies a person. But there are times when work is just an excuse you tell yourself." He had been ready to argue about the morality of command, about the obligations that demanded he remain. Instead, he let her say it. Let the sentence hang between them and glitter like glass. Emma's eyes were steady. She was not a child who needed to be soothed with stories of sacrifice. She was a woman who had designed a life with someone else, and she wanted to know if he was part of it. "You were part of mine," she said after a moment. "I wanted you there because I thought family meant you. I didn't want mercy. I wanted you." There was a tenderness in that, a softness that was not about forgiveness. It was an accusation softened into a request. Marcus saw his daughter in a way that made him feel older than he had counted in his service years. He had taught her to throw a baseball and to tie a tie. She had taught him how to watch another person breathe and count the small ways they do not change. "I thought I was keeping you safe," he said. It was the oldest lie he had ever told Dee, that absence was preservation. "I thought if the world needed me, I had to be there." Emma's laugh was small and bitter. "So the world asked more of you than your daughter." She stepped closer, and for an instant Marcus felt the years peel away. "Do you think it's the world that changes people, Dad? Or is it the small decisions they make when no one is watching?" Before he could answer, the chapel doors swung inward, like a soft breath. Marcus's body jerked. He turned to see the room beyond the stained glass, framed not with parishioners, but with his unit, and they were standing in reverent rows. Some wore civilian clothes, others still in damp uniforms, but they moved with the slow composure of people who had rehearsed sorrow and joy in equal measure. They had come back from the flood, not to march and make a show, but to stand, to make a shape in the room that would let his daughter see the man he had been to other people. Sergeant Rosa Alvarez stepped forward and did not announce herself. She threw a glance toward Marcus and then to Emma, and her expression was one of someone having the extraordinary ability to speak for two different lives at once. "We wanted to give her what you could not be there to give," she said plainly. "Not because you asked us to, but because it was the right thing to do." Marcus felt a movement under his ribs like the shift of a tectonic plate. The men and women in that line were not merely soldiers, they were witnesses to the life Marcus had lived, to the years of work that had siphoned time away. They had not been ordered to stand in the chapel. They had chosen, clothed their own reasons, and wrapped them in the epaulets of respect. Emma's eyes moved along the row and fell on faces she had never known intimately. They were the faces of strangers who had become the soft backdrop to her loss. She swallowed, and a laugh broke from her throat like a rush of wind. Daniel, her husband, stood beside her with his hand finding hers. He was not the sort to be overpowered by spectacle. He'd stood at the altar like a man with a steady heart. Marcus had met Daniel once. A meeting relatively short and suffused with good intentions. Now he watched as Daniel's fingers found Emma's, and something in Marcus loosened. The young man had become her partner regardless of corporate duty or calculated absence. Rosa took a step nearer to the edge of the altar and performed the small ritual of someone trying not to make a speech. "Captain Hale," she addressed him directly. "We left the convoy at midday. The sergeants argued about it for a while. A few of us went to get suits, if you can believe it. We told them we were here on official business." She let the joke settle like a coin on a table. "Then we went into town and made sure that someone was going to walk your daughter down the aisle." Marcus felt his vin in shape of a man in his unit he'd once disciplined for insubordination. Private Tom Benson, who had helped Marcus carry sandbags for hours, cursing all the while. Private Benson stood with a small packet clasped in his hands, a folded piece of paper. Marcus understood instinctively that it was a program, perhaps something they had clutched during the ceremony. Perhaps a note left for him. "We're not trying to replace you." Rosa continued, "Captain, no one could. We just know what it means to follow someone. We wanted Emma not to wonder." She inclined her head, not to Marcus alone, but to the assembled room. "We wanted her to know that the people who followed you into the river and the dark. We aren't your absence. We're your witness." It was a strange kind of absolution, thin and complex as gauze. Marcus had led men into storms and out of floods. He had never been offered this particular mercy, to have his choices covered by the ones who had lived them with him. He had trained them, scolded them, celebrated with them, but he had never expected them to step into the domestic life he'd sidelined. Their presence was not a replacement. It was presence. Emma reached out then, and Marcus felt an old reflex in his chest. Protectiveness, like a bell he could not quiet. She took a program from Private Benson's hand and smoothed it in the way a woman smooths the edge of an argument. "You didn't have to," she said to them. "But thank you. Everyone here did what they thought they should," Rosa answered. "Some of us dug graves, some of us," she gave a small, private smile. "Some of us bought ribbon." The room opened with small laughter like wind through an alley. The soldiers were no longer only soldiers. They were friends who had suffered and arranged for a stranger's ritual because they knew the shape of absence and how it hollowed people out. Marcus felt the words gather in him like rainwater. He thought of all the mornings he had chosen to be anywhere but at home, thinking the world's need outweighed the small human duties. He thought of Emma's childhood, when scraped knees were traded for bandages and lullabies hummed under the hum of the radio. He thought of Sandy's tired thanks, and of Emma's voice memo that had been both brittle and brave. "I don't know how to accept this," he said finally. "I don't know what to tell you besides thank you. For your service. For being decent." For Rosa's look was an answer and a challenge. "Do better, Captain," she said, small enough to be intimate but firm like a baton. "That's all I'm asking." He laughed then, a short, shocked sound. "Do better," he repeated, and the phrase became a promise he had to keep in some form that would not be another ledger. He had to learn to be steady in the spaces between disasters, to be present when the world was ordinary, and to find the courage that looked small and domestic. After the gathering, when the plates had been cleared and Emma's dress still smelled faintly of roses, they walked out into the cooling air. The gravely dark of the parking lot was speckled with dew. Marcus stood under the sycamore and watched as his men and women dispersed, to cars, to trailers, to someone's wife or partner waiting with a concerned, tired face. The movement felt like prayer. He drove with Emma and Daniel, sitting side by side in the front seat of his old pickup. Emma had a white ribbon tangled in her fingers. Daniel's tie was slightly askew, a human child of the hour. Marcus navigated the familiar streets slowly, paying attention to the small things. The bakery's neon sign flickering, the municipal building's flags limp in the slight wind. He wanted to say the right number of words, to stitch the evening into something like a new beginning. "Did you know they made a playlist?" Emma asked as they crossed the bridge. It was an unlikely question, domestic and ordinary. She wanted the mood of the car to be light. My bridesmaids uploaded it because they said, if you were here, we'd want you to dance." He imagined them dancing in the parish hall earlier. Emma, and men and women who had never been to the sort of weddings that had music that made the floor hum. The thought made him ache in a way that was not all regret. There was a soft tenderness there, a recognition of life that moved forward despite his failings. "I'd like to dance with you," Marcus said before thinking. The words surprised both of them. Emma's hand left the ribbon and found his on the steering wheel, squeezing in a way that said she had heard his admission and would keep it in an accessible place. They did not speak of forgetting the absence. They did not pretend it had not happened. But in that moment, the car smelled like coffee and nicotine and the faint floral hush of a dress. It was ordinary and real, and it felt like the only fertilizer for growth. In the weeks that followed, Marcus made the small, stubborn decisions that do not have the glamour of command, but are heavier in their way. By degree, he scheduled a dinner twice a month at his daughter's new home. He came to the school plays Emma attended, now as a community volunteer, and he began to reinvest his time in the small routines that signal presence. They were not spectacular, but they were steady. Sometimes steady means showing up to water the same pot of soil every day. There were hard days. Sometimes Emma's face would fold into the ledger she had folded and file away for later review. Marcus would write notes that said, "I'm sorry," and leave them tucked where she made her coffee. He learned to be unromantic about the work of repairing human bonds. Not speeches, but attention, not grand gestures, but consistency. The unit became part of that life too. They invited Emma and Daniel to their annual field barbecue. Rosa taught Emma to tie a knot with the practicality of someone who knows that a good knot gets you out alive. Emma taught Rosa how to fold a napkin with the precision of someone who liked making homes pretty. One October afternoon, as the leaves began to iron themselves thin and red, Marcus found the parish hall quiet and sat at the head of a plastic table that bore the faint stains of many dinners. Sergeant Alvarez leaned against the wall, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. "You did well," she said without trying to make it small. He laughed, the old, surprised sound. "Because my men walked my daughter down the aisle. Because you came back to the things that matter in time." She corrected gently. "Because you stopped telling yourself every absence was noble. Some things are duty." She set the cup down. "Some things are family." "It's complicated," Marcus said. It was almost a defense. The world never furnished simple choices. Duty required him in ways that were sometimes morally unavoidable. But then he thought about the night under the overpass, the water like ink swallowing a truck, and he felt that duty had been tangible and worth every hour. Complication could be a refuge for the cowardly and a truth for the brave. He chose to be the brave kind that day under the sycamore. Rosa's eyes crinkled, and she smiled in the way people do when they are trying to coax something into life. "You should teach Daniel how to check a bilge pump," she said. For the record. He pictured the awkward young man at the altar, neat and a little startled, and smiled. "I will," he said. "If he can teach me how to brew better coffee." "Deal," she said, and their laughter dissolved the room into something like a truce with the past. In time, the wedding was no longer a singular wound, but a hinge. It remained an event that had happened, something they could place on a timeline and learn from. Marcus and Emma learned to talk about their disappointments without making them into armor. They pulled the ledger out and wrote new entries, not in ink but in daily lives: a barbecue, a phone call during a training exercise that asked, "How's the pie?" Instead of rehearsal for a speech. The guard remained a force that asked things of him, but he began to measure his obligations with different instruments, not only by how the radio crackled with need, but by how a voice answered on the other end of the line when he asked, "Are you okay?" There were still nights he could not attend. Injuries on the highway, storms that made the sirens sing like banshees. But when he was able to be present, he was. The unit taught him this lesson, perhaps better than anyone else. You can be accountable to more than one family. When your men and women step into your life, not as substitutes, but as witnesses, they remind you that your life is not only a ledger, but a communal embroidery in which each stitch is visible and required. One evening by the river, Marcus watched Emma with Daniel as they loaded a small canoe. She tossed her hair in a way that made him remember a 7-year-old's braids whipped by the wind. He sat on the bank with Sergeant Alvarez and looked at the water that once had taken so much and given him perspective. "You ever think about leaving?" Emma asked him, suddenly wide open in the hush of the bank, her voice floating. "Leaving what?" He looked at his daughter. She was older now. The years had done what they do, sculpted and softened. He thought about leaving the guard, about stepping out of the rhythm that had become as much home as the small clapboard house he rented. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But the guard has been a way of measuring myself. It's how I know what I can do when things go wrong." "You measuring yourself doesn't always map to what we need," she said. "Not a blame, but a counsel. Measure yourself for the person who's in front of you, too. That's how you're going to be kept." He looked at her and laughed softly. "That sounds like a rehearsal line." "No," she said. "It sounds like advice." They sat a long while in the twilight and watched the canoe cut a small V into the darkening river. The night smelled of iron and leaves, and the stars began to stitch themselves into the black like careless sequins. Marcus thought of the chapel and the empty chair, of the men and women who had chosen to stand instead of watching at the edge. He thought of duty and of the strange, unpatterned ways dedication could both take and return. He thought of the choir loft and of Sandy's small hands. He thought of the program he had carried like a map, now folded into something safe. In the end, it was not one grand apology that healed things. It was a string of small choices, a soldier's hours traded for fathering hours, a surrender to the simplicity of being present when present was needed. The unit's surprise had been a bridge, not so he could walk back through his past without taking responsibility, but so he could see how the people he had led would stand for him in ways that were not always asked. They had chosen him as family, not because he had been perfect, but because he had been present when they needed him most. When he stood again in the chapel months later, this time for a small blessing for the couple and their first anniversary, Marcus watched Emma move through the open doors with a kind of careful joy. She glanced back at him, and this time there was no ledger between them. There was a table covered in food, ribbons, and a row of people who no longer needed to announce their love because it had been spoken in deeds. That night, the guard, his unit, sat among parishioners and family, eating cake and making jokes, comfortable in the quiet way of people who had learned what it meant to hold both duty and home. He had missed the wedding for duty. He had thought duty always asked the most. But that day, the chapel door opening revealed not an accusation, but a community. a unit of men and women who chose to inherit the task of giving his daughter away when he could not. That gesture did not wash the hurt clean, it braided something new, a tethering that would hold him when the next storm came. And when it did, he would stand, not in a chair of absence, but in the middle of a life he had fought for and at last learned to protect.